Let's learn about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was an American preacher, humanitarian, and activist who is best known for his role in the African American civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. Dr. King, who was inspired by his faith and the peaceful teachings of Mahatma Gandhi, is considered one of history's greatest champions of nonviolence. He used the power of his words as well as peaceful demonstrations such as protests, sit-ins, and boycotts in an effort to achieve equality for all people. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is a true American hero. Let's learn more about his life and how he inspired a nation and the world to become more tolerant and accepting of all citizens, regardless of race, class, or gender. Martin Luther King Jr. was born on Tuesday, January 15, 1929, in Atlanta, Georgia, at 12 p.m. His name at birth was Michael King. His father, also named Michael, changed both their names to Martin Luther in honor of the world-renowned German reformer of the same name. Martin Jr. was a middle child. He had an older sister named Willie Christine King and a younger brother named Alfred Daniel Williams King. Martin Jr. attended Booker T. Washington High School and was so smart he skipped both the 9th and 12th grades. He enrolled in Morehouse College at age 15 without formally graduating from high school. During his final semester at Morehouse College, Martin was ordained as a minister. He also took his first steps towards being an activist by writing a letter to the editor of the Atlanta Constitution. In the letter, he declared that African Americans were entitled to the basic rights and opportunities of American citizens. After graduating from Morehouse, Martin attended Crozer Theological Seminary in Pennsylvania from 1948 until 1951. Martin then began his doctoral studies at Boston University. During this time, he began to draw from his education, his faith, and his natural verbal ability to form the foundation for what would become his critical role in the civil rights movement. While in Boston, Martin met and dated Coretta Scott, who was a student at the New England Conservatory of Music. On June 18, 1953, they were married in Alabama, where Coretta's family lived. Martin and Coretta became the parents of 4 children: Yolanda King, Martin Luther King III, Dexter Scott King, and Bernice King. On December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks was arrested for refusing to give her seat to a white person on a crowded bus in Montgomery, Alabama, a city known for its segregated public spaces. That night, Martin met with other activists to plan a citywide protest that would become known as the Montgomery Bus Boycott. The boycott lasted over 380 days. During this time, Martin was arrested and harassed by people who did not want the changes he was fighting to bring about. The boycott, however, was a success. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled that racial segregation and transportation was unconstitutional. Martin's role in the boycott transformed him into a national figure and the best-known spokesman of the civil rights movement. In the wake of the boycott victory, civil rights leaders recognized the need for national organizations to better coordinate their efforts. In January 1957, Martin and roughly 60 other ministers and activists founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or the SCLC. With Martin as president, the SCLC helps conduct nonviolent protests and demonstrations across the South to promote civil rights reforms. A primary focus for the organization was registering African Americans to vote. The SCLC sponsored mass meetings in key southern cities, for that purpose. In 1963, Martin led a coalition of several civil rights groups and a nonviolent campaign aimed at Birmingham, Alabama, which was at the time described as the most segregated city in America. The nation was shocked to see images of young African Americans attacked by police dogs and high-pressure fire hoses displayed on television, newspapers, and magazines. It was during this campaign that Martin wrote his now famous letter from the Birmingham jail after being arrested again for his participation in the demonstrations later in 1963. Martin was one of the driving forces behind the March for Jobs and Freedom, more commonly known as the March on Washington, on August 28, 1963. Over 250,000 people of all ethnicities gathered at the National Mall in Washington, D.C. to demand justice and equality for all people. It was here that Martin made his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. Delivered from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, this speech inspired the nation and is now considered one of the greatest in American history. Martin was later named Time Magazine's Man of the Year. This further cemented his status as the nation's foremost social change leader. In 1964, at 35 years old, Martin became the youngest person ever to win the Nobel Peace Prize. When he found out that he had been selected, he promised to donate the prize money, over $54,000, to help continue the important work of the civil rights movement. He delivered another powerful speech when he accepted his award that was both moving and motivational. Also, in 1964, partly due to the March on Washington and Martin's speech, Congress passed the landmark Civil Rights Act. This legislation made it illegal to discriminate against people because of their race. The Jim Crow rules of the South that promoted segregation and the harsh mistreatment of African Americans were now against federal law. This was one of the greatest accomplishments for the civil rights movement in March of 1965. Martin led a march from Selma to the Capitol building in Montgomery, Alabama, to urge President Lyndon B. Johnson and his administration to pass a law protecting the rights of African American voters. At the conclusion of the march, Martin gave another powerful speech that helped rally more supporters. That same year, Congress went on to pass the Voting Rights Act that eliminated the remaining barriers to voting for African Americans prior to this legislation. There were still areas in which African Americans were completely disenfranchised, meaning they did not have the right to vote. Over the next 3 years, Martin's focus is shifted from racial discrimination to economic injustice and international peace. He led campaigns in Chicago, Illinois, and spoke strongly against the Vietnam War. Martin's opposition to the war cost him support among white allies, including the President Union leaders and publishers. Martin and the SCLC also organized the Poor People's Campaign in 1968 in an effort to assemble a multiracial coalition of poor Americans who would advocate for economic change. On April 4th, 1968, Martin was shot while standing on the balcony outside of his hotel room at a hotel in Memphis, Tennessee at 7:05 p.m. Martin was pronounced dead at St. Joseph's Hospital. He was 39 years old, and Martin was buried in his hometown of Atlanta, Georgia. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. changed the course of American history. He worked tirelessly to ensure that all people, regardless of race, religion, or national origin, had equal opportunities and could live their lives without fear of violence and discrimination. Martin is regarded as America's greatest human rights advocate. In 1983, President Ronald Reagan signed a bill creating a federal holiday honoring Dr. Martin. The holiday, observed on the third Monday of January, each year is called Martin Luther King Jr. Day, or MLK Day. In the year 2000, it was officially observed by all 50 states for the first time.